Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us today to the 2024 late summer air law reception. As many of you know, that was the result of the general elections, which prevented us hosting the event at a more appropriate time, but I think it turned out very well. We have a record attendance apparently. So thank you all for joining and for supporting our events throughout the years. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm George Deludas. I'm the vice chair of the committee of the air law group, which has 20 members. Most of the members joined us today, which is a good thing. And Peter Ninan is heading it, Peter here. And Joanna Liadelis is the secretary of the group. Now, as you know, most of you, the event is usually being hosted upstairs, but we had some emergency work done, so we moved it downstairs to the Bill Boeing Lecture Theatre, which is a good thing overall, because now we can record it, and we will upload the recording on YouTube. The reception will take place in the room where you had the coffee and tea. And on that note, I would like to thank stewards and Peter Ninan for contributing 40 bottles of wine for the event today, which I think will be enough as long as we behave. But maybe these were the famous last words for tonight. Now, also the reception will be 2 hours long, to accommodate those who complained last year that 1 hour is not enough to commingle, as we say in the shipping industry. Now, there's a video that we all need to watch with the housekeeping matters. I was replaced on that because I keep forgetting housekeeping matters with low level of technology, but there you go.
Hello and welcome to number 4 Hamilton Place, the home of the Royal Aeronautical Society. Your safety is important to us. We'd like to take a moment to remind you of our essential building safety procedures. There are no planned fire alarm tests during today's event, therefore if the alarm sounds, please leave the building by your nearest available exit. Please do not use the lift when exiting in an emergency. If you have mobility or access issues, please make yourself known to a member of our team so that we can make necessary arrangements for your safe exit from the building. Our designated assembly point is the paved area at the junction of Hamilton Place and Piccadilly, just beyond the Intercontinental Hotel. Society staff will be on hand to guide you. In order to avoid distractions for your fellow attendees, please make sure that you turn all mobile phones and devices to silent or off. Please ensure you don't leave any bags or personal items unattended, and please do report anything suspicious to our team. If the event has an opportunity for questions, please raise your hand and wait for a member of the team to bring you a microphone before speaking. Some events may have a fixed microphone on a stand. If so, please ask your question there. If you need any assistance at all, please don't hesitate to ask one of our team who will be happy to help you. Thank you for your attention, and once again, welcome to the Royal Aeronautical Society.
It's not exactly BA in-flight quality, but we have done our best, I think. It's as good as it gets. Now, let me introduce now our speaker. I think this year we have the pleasure to host Professor Alison Young, who is Sir David Williams Professor of Public Law at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Robinson College. Now, we have invited Alison in her capacity as the Commissioner for Public Law and Westlaw, being in charge of the recent consultation of the Law Commission on Aviation Autonomy, which essentially assesses whether the legal framework in the UK is good enough or sufficient to accommodate novel flying technologies. Now, we met Alison when we prepared the Society's submission response to the Law Commission's consultation, and that was headed by Peter Ninan, and several of our members joined in contributing for the response, and also several groups of the Society contributed to our response. And then we were impressed by the commitment of Alison and her team, and we have 2 members of her team here with us, Connor and Henny, to answer your questions. We were impressed by their commitment to making this consultation a worthwhile venture, because I think we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to shape future aviation laws in this country. And those 3 people are in charge of it, no stress about it. Now, what is the purpose of our speech today, of our lecture today? We want you to come into a dialogue with the Commission. The Commission welcomes your views, wants to hear from you as aviation lawyers and aviation practitioners. And so feel free to ask any questions you have to Alison, to ask any questions after the lecture to Henry, Connor, and Alison during the drinks, because we think it will be mutually beneficial, both for the Commission and for the aviation legal community, to learn from each other and to be prepared for the potential change in the laws in the future. So you heard enough from me. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers.
Thank you very much, George and Peter, for inviting me and for that excellent introduction. And I feel after the safety talk, I need to point out the exits are there, and there, and there. And hopefully that means you'll all be able to escape safely should there be any form of, hopefully no aviation-related disaster this evening. I also want to thank you very much for the responses we have already had to our consultation exercise. As you know from George's introduction, I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I'm used to things being complicated. And then I looked at aviation law and realised the Constitution has nothing on some of the complexities in this area. So it's been a very steep learning curve to get to grips with the law in this area, and we really do benefit from all your expertise in the room and all the help you've been able to offer so far. So thank you so much for that, and we really do look forward to maintaining this relationship and maintaining this conversation. So I'll now see if I can get my device to work. So what I want to do this evening is basically just to give you a little bit of an introduction to who the Law Commission are, what we do, and where we are with the Aviation Autonomy project at the moment. And then I want to introduce you to some of the issues we've come across while trying to think about how we get a legal framework that can make sure we have a safe system going forward, but also recognises new and emerging technologies, so we're in a good position to be able to regulate these technologies as they come forward in the field of aviation and autonomy. I then want to lead on very briefly to an overview of where we are with our second consultation and what we've been discovering so far, and then hopefully throw it open to questions and discussion. So I'm going to be very ably joined by Connor, who's the lead lawyer on the project, who will know all the answers to the questions. No pressure, Connor. So hopefully we'll be able to facilitate the discussion going forward. So just to give you an idea of who the Law Commission is, for those of you who aren't used to working with us, we are what's known as an arm's length body. So what this means is that we are not connected to the government in the sense of following government policies, but we do work with government. So we're overseen, but we are independent. And our independence is crucially important to us. So our role is to modernise and simplify the law, and we do so through a series of projects. And you can tell we're independent because the commissioners are appointed independently. We're overseen by the chair, who is a member of the Court of Appeal. And we take our independence seriously. We want to make sure that we persuade through evidence and not through policies and political viewpoints, which is why our consultation exercises are so important to us. We want to make sure we lead on evidence-based backed suggestions, which is why we work on thinking about building consensus, using lawyers who are experts in a particular area and reaching out to people like you who know the ins and outs of the industries that we're trying to regulate. Quite a lot of the projects we do look at sort of technical areas of the law, looking at technical problems and trying to reform these particular areas of the law that don't happen to be working. What aviation autonomy is an example of is a different type of project that is starting to come through to the Commission that we've been looking at particularly in public law and the Law in Wales team, which is when we're looking at new emerging technologies. How do we get a regulatory framework that will work to make sure that as this new technology comes through, the law is in place to facilitate innovation, but also do so in a way that maintains the values within a particular legal system. So in aviation autonomy, that's making sure we can facilitate technological developments while also making sure we keep safety paramount. So how do we get the framework that will get that to work? And we're building a lot here on the framework that we've had from automated vehicles. So Connor also worked on our automated vehicle project, and looking at the ins and outs of how we work with automation with regard to vehicles. That project led to the Automated Vehicle Act 2024, leading to a kind of regulatory framework that thinks about how do we maintain this while having more sort of detailed regulations coming through, so we make sure we maintain safety with automated vehicles. So we're building very much on that knowledge and that expertise to take it forward. So that's where we're coming from and what we're hoping to do in this particular project. So the Aviation Autonomy project was started in September 2022, and we were asked by the CAA and the Department for Transport to look into this regulatory framework. We're also part of the Future Flight issue, which has been funded through UKRI. So we've got a whole bunch of people coming together to help us fund these particular projects. And what we've been asked to do is think about different areas of the law that might need to change to facilitate autonomous systems in aviation. Now, I don't need to tell most of you in the room that a lot of what goes on in aviation law is based on the idea that you have a pilot in an aircraft, a pilot in command. So a lot of the law works on that assumption of there being a human in the plane who's in charge, who's then piloting the plane. So the question then becomes, what happens when you take the human away from the plane? And there are different ways in which you can do that. What happens if you've got a fully automated system? What happens if you've got a remote pilot? Does the remote pilot have exactly the same kind of knowledge, the same responsibilities as a pilot in command in a plane? We're also used to the idea that communication is often done between a human and a human. But what happens if moving forward that disappears? How do we maintain these systems can work and work efficiently and effectively, have proper certification, be safe, when we change all these different assumptions? And also from the legal perspective, how do we deal with these differences when we're thinking about aspects of civil and criminal responsibility if and when things go wrong? Not just to have that framework there, but also so we can learn from the error and make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. These are not easy questions to answer, which is why we're having to think very carefully and very long and hard about how we're going to move on to answer these particular questions, and this is why we have split our project into different phases. Because the more we look into these areas, the more complicated it becomes, and the more care we're trying to take to make sure we get these answers right. So the first phase of the project has been looking at the understanding of how automated vehicles work in aviation, what we might need. As I said, it's been part of the Future Flight Challenge, which has been funded by the UKRI as well, and we've had a large amount of investment through that scheme to be thinking about how we're going to move this forward. The last phase of the project, which I'll present a little bit on towards the end, is moving on away from thinking about automated planes and automated system within aviation towards how we think about air traffic management and air traffic control systems, ATM, ATS. How do we get those working efficiently? A, will they become more automated as we move forward? And B, how do we get those working efficiently, effectively with automated and remotely piloted aircraft? So we're moving on to looking at that issue now. So as you see, we're trying to break it all up. The aim is to have a report that will be presented to Parliament in late 2025. Now, as an independent body, we produce reports. Those reports are laid before Parliament, and the government has 6 months in which to respond to our report. As I said, we hope to persuade them through our evidence and expertise, but obviously it's not up to us as to whether that will then become law. That becomes part of the political process. So the more we have good answers, good expert reasons, the more persuasive we can be to make sure the law moving forward is one that will suit our particular backdrop and framework. So that's a little bit about the Law Commission and what the project is. I want to move on to think a little bit more about what we're having to look at and look at this through our particular case studies and the issues we've come across. So being lawyers, the first thing we do is go away and look at the current legal framework. It's odd that always seems to be our starting point. And as most of you in the room will know, this isn't, again, an easy thing to do when we're thinking about aviation. So when we look at the current legal framework that we're working with, often when we're dealing with projects in the UK, we're very used to dealing with domestic law. That's not the case in aviation, and understandably so. The whole point of aviation and how it's made such a change in society is because it's been a major driver in globalization. If you want aviation to be safe and to have journeys between different countries, you're going to need coordination, you're going to need rules that work effectively across all the countries in the globe. So, understandably, we're looking at this law against the backdrop of international law, which means the Chicago Convention, and looking at the work of the International Civil Aviation Organization, which, as you know, goes away, produces standards and recommended practices, SARPs, which then become annexed to the convention. Now, the way UK law works is just because something has happened in international law doesn't mean that automatically becomes part of domestic law. So we have to look at the international backdrop, we have to think about this international law obligations, and then we have various aspects of domestic law that will implement those particular obligations. And it isn't necessarily the case that we will implement all of these different elements coming through. So there'll be some areas, for example, where we might not have implemented some aspects of international agreements. We do most, but when we look at hijacking, so you get a bit of a teaser. One of the reasons we have issues with hijacking is we haven't necessarily ratified a particular protocol. So, different aspects will operate in different ways. As well as the backdrop of international law, we also have the backdrop of what is now known as assimilated law. And this is where I give my age away. So when I spend my time lecturing in constitutional law, a lot of my discussion was about how we implemented Brexit and how we went from EU law to retained EU law to assimilated law. And when I said to my students, resistance is futile, nobody laughed. So I realized I was ancient and also probably a bit too much of a tech nerd for my general student. So I went away ashamed of my age, but never mind. But resistance is futile to assimilated law. So we now have a whole system of rules that derive from the EU. Obviously, post-Brexit, we're in a different legal background framework. So we have the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which sets out the extent to which we have cooperation in the field of aviation. Because again, obviously, we want to make sure we're going to have a system of laws that does link into what's going on in other countries, particularly across Europe. And a lot of the EU rules have become assimilated law, which are now part of domestic law and incorporated into how the system works in these particular areas. So we have a snapshot of EU laws that became these assimilated laws. And so we have the basic regulation, and we also have assimilated regulation and the UAS delegated regulation. So all of these have become part of assimilated law, but are then part of domestic law. And underneath that, we have other general domestic law and also delegated legislation. So we've got a complex legal background we need to understand and come to grips with if we're going to think about what aspects of it do and do not work when we're thinking about dealing with uncrewed aircraft or automated aviation systems. We also need to think very carefully about what changes we do make, how that links into international law. So we've got to keep an eye on what's happening internationally, as well as what's happening in Europe, which, although that doesn't mean we have to comply with EU law, because of the backdrop of the TCA and the element of cooperation in aviation, we need to be aware of what's going on in those areas as well. So we need to be thinking very carefully about the different legal background in order to get this to work efficiently and effectively. So one of the things we've been coming across, so one of the issues we tend to find is we do have a large regulatory framework, but often lawyers like to come up with what we think will be nice, easy classifications that will make the law work better, because that's what we like to do. If we can come up with lovely generalisation and makes the law nice and simple and easy to work, then that's something we're going to go for. That is not something you can do very easily in this field, as we keep discovering and going down and unpacking the particular layers. So to start with, we have to think about how do we deal with what these automated vehicles are in aircraft, what do we call them? So we often come across the phrase unmanned aircraft. Now, being the Law Commission, we do not like gendered language, so we've changed this to uncrewed. But that doesn't help either, because it isn't necessarily a term everybody knows, and it also isn't necessarily getting it fully across, because it's not a pilot, as well as there may be a crew, there may not be a crew. You might not have a crew, but have uncrewed isn't necessarily going to get that across either. So we have to think very carefully about what does this mean. We then have further problems that lead to ins and outs of how this works. So if we think about different legal definitions, where we come across when we look about unmanned aircraft, we have one definition of an unmanned aircraft as an aircraft which is intended to operate with no pilot on board. Okay. Then we'll have the basic regulation that says an unmanned aircraft is any aircraft operating or designed to operate autonomously or to be piloted remotely without a pilot on board. So we've got a common theme of not having a pilot on board, but then we've got a further distinction that we're coming across, the distinction between autonomous aircraft that are flying themselves autonomously and remotely piloted aircraft. So of course, being lawyers, we think, what about that distinction? Will that work to help us think about things going forward? They raise different problems. And then you realise that this distinction is not clear. And obviously not clear. Because if you had a remotely piloted aircraft, what happens if something goes wrong with the remote pilot? You'd probably want a system on that aircraft autonomously to at least fly safely for a while until the pilot could then deal with that particular problem. So you're not going to have something that's purely remotely piloted that doesn't necessarily also have some form of autonomous systems going on in the background. And you're probably going to find that most autonomous systems are then going to have pilots overseeing. And the pilots that are remotely piloting aren't necessarily piloting in the sense of manoeuvring the aircraft in exactly the same way that the pilot in command would be doing in an aircraft. They might be overseeing. They might be looking at different systems coming forward and just being alerted to problems, or they might be meant to be overseeing all of them without an alert system going on. So it's not as straightforward. So although we can see them as generic classifications, we have to be particularly aware of when they overlap, of when there might be different forms of what we mean by being remotely piloted, if they're being piloted, if they're being overseen, and the extent to which something's autonomous and then remotely piloted. And then if that wasn't enough, you're obviously going to have people maybe swapping between them. Maybe you'll have something that's remotely piloted for takeoff, automated while it's cruising, and then remotely piloted again when it lands. So it's not as simple and straightforward as trying to make these classifications. So we're trying to think very carefully, talk with experts about how this does and does not work, so we can make sure it works properly. So another problem we've come across is what we mean by autonomous and the difficulties we get when thinking about an autonomous operation. So again, it's building on these different problems. Do we mean it's unmanned with a remote pilot? Do we mean there's other things going on? And obviously, when we're trying to think about what we mean by autonomy, we've been looking very carefully at different systems, and particularly looking at the gyrus scale, trying to think about different layers of what we mean by being automated in different circumstances. Aviation is already quite highly automated. So we're thinking about something on top of that, and what does that mean? So we're thinking very much about the extent to which you've got a human in the loop and a machine in the loop, and the different responsibilities of machines and humans in those particular circumstances. So we're thinking more about a sliding scale, about when do we reach the situation where it's more a machine that's doing the most work or the human, and how do we deal with those different layers in between? So are you dealing with systems where you've got oversight? Have you got management by exception, where the machine is doing most things, but it hits an exceptional circumstance, alerts a remote pilot or a human who then intervenes? Or are you dealing with situations where you might be presented with a range of options and the human makes the choice? Or does the machine make the choice and the human is overseeing that choice to make sure that's being operated effectively? Or do you have a human just not there at all? And most things aren't at the extreme scale of fully human, fully machine. They're all at different layers in between. So we're having to think very carefully about what automation means. So to try and make that more easy for us, we've been trying to come up with some case studies. Now, we know these are not the only possible case studies, but we hoped that these gave us good things to work on, to move forward, so we can start thinking about these issues in a way that is not as abstract, that is more easy to understand and more accessible. So our case studies have been looking at drones, we've been looking at vertical takeoff and landing craft, and the extent to which they'll become more automated with passengers involved. And obviously, in our third case, we're looking at air traffic management and air navigation services. So these are just our starting point to get us thinking about these issues, which then we can start thinking about ways in which other issues are similar and different, so we can hopefully get a regulatory framework that moves forward. Now, before I started this task, I thought I knew what a drone was. I realised I didn't have a clue. So I was, like most people, thinking I was just this nice little recreational craft that I've seen people playing with, outside. No. So I'm learning a lot about what a drone is and what it can be used for. So we recognise it's not a legal term, there isn't a universally accepted definition, but it's just a term of art that we're trying to think about this idea of a smaller, uncrewed aircraft which is unoccupied by humans or passengers and is mostly, could be remotely piloted, could be piloted, could be autonomous, but we're thinking more kind of the type of drones you're thinking about which can be used in delivery services, emergency services, perhaps particularly for my sake, if they could have a drone checking the electric power lines between Cambridge train station and King's Cross, I would be very grateful, because as one of my jokes in my team is I tend to jinx trains. Every time I get on a train it gets delayed, so if someone would like to use the drone for that, I'd be very grateful. But it's also elements of surveillance, agriculture, telecoms. There's lots of different uses that pose different problems. So we have to think generically why they're different, and also how can they be used differently in different circumstances, and what will that require. And our other use case is vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Again, using this in terms of smaller passenger-carrying aircraft, but obviously we can then think about what about if we ended up with larger passenger aircraft, would there be other problems that we need to think about? But also we're thinking about this because it raises a distinct element with regard to urban mobility. So is its aim to try and give greater mobility? Does that mean there are other requirements it needs? Other problems that come to light when you're dealing with navigating in close urban spaces, as opposed to more used to kind of larger flights in open airspace where you're not having to deal as much with flying in, sort of taking off, flying short distances in an urban area and then landing again. So does that give rise to other particular problems that we'll need to think about to move forward? So what kind of issues have we been coming across? Well, drones are not going to be much use for deliveries and emergencies and necessarily checking power lines if they always have to be within visual line of sight. But at the moment, it's much easier to be able to fly your drone if it's in visual line of sight, because then you can fall in the open category. But if you're going beyond visual line of sight, then you're going to have to go through a various system of operational authorization from the CAA. So one of the things we need to think about is, as they become more routine, should we still be going through a system of having specific operational authorization? Could there be situations in which we would want to find various classifications that are easy to classify? Because obviously, the more of these systems you get coming through, are you going to have the resources to be able to deal with all of these specific classifications? Is it going to take too long? Is it going to stifle innovation because you don't necessarily fit a preordained category? And by the time you've got approval, you've moved on to a different drone that does something else, and you've got to get approval for that. So we need to think about the ins and outs of how that is going to work. We also need to think about whether the O rules for the open category themselves work. Is the weight right? Is that really where the drone is safe? Or do they need to be less weight? Are there other things that would make it safer or not safe in those circumstances? So we need to think about how we deal with these particular systems and how it works. And the way it tends to work at the moment is, as I said, through thinking about these different extra layers, mostly thinking carefully about safety. So the lower the risk, the easier it is to approve it. The higher the risk, the harder it is going to be to approve it. So open categories, we're normally thinking, well, small leisure activities, not so much of a problem. The more it becomes more complicated, the more you're going to want a specific category. or certified category for new things. And we can understand how that makes sense. But as I said, we still need to think carefully about whether these categories are looking at the right things, are drawing the lines in the right place, and are making sure we have safety. We're also going to have to keep an eye on, as these specific categories are developed, are they going to be the right kind of categories? Will they work efficiently and effectively? And we're going to have to think very carefully about making sure safety is still paramount without stifling innovation. And I wish I had the answer. I don't. But we know the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about, and the more we ask these questions, get discussions, get information from the experts, the more likely we are to get this right going forward. So, we ask you questions. And this is an example of one of the questions we've been thinking about in our first consultation paper, thinking about the ins and outs of low-risk autonomous drones or drone operations conducted beyond visual line of sight. We need to think about, are there any beyond visual line of sight categories you think would be safe, such they could move into the open category now? Or is that not, are we not there yet? Do we still need to keep going through this particular system? What kind of things should we be asking to make it easier to classify the safer ones, to get a quick route through, and which ones shouldn't be seen to go into this category and moved on to other categories to maintain safety? So that's one issue we've been trying to think about. The other element we need to think about is, obviously, when we're thinking about piloting aircraft, you've got one pilot in command of one aircraft. But when we're thinking about drones, you might be thinking about a pilot overseeing or regulating lots of drones at any one time. So how do you deal with this particular situation? How do you deal where you've got one pilot overseeing a series of drones? What about, should there be a difference between a drone swarm, where you've got the drones interacting with each other and flying together, or where you've got one pilot dealing with 5 different drones, all at different stages, doing different things in different places, some of them taking off, some of them landing, some of them just flying and doing a delivery somewhere else? How does the law deal with these particular elements? So we need to think carefully about how we deal with those particular issues, how we deal with whether we think you can have multiple simultaneous operations. We also need to think about their safety. Are they more or less safe if you've got multiple drones operating in drone swarms than if you've just got one drone? We've got to think about the ins and outs of oversight. When do we need, when do you want a pilot to have the main responsibility? When is it okay for it to be flown more or less autonomous with the pilot just overseeing it? What kind of factors do we need to take account of? And is there a limit? Is that, you can have 5 drones, but once you hit 5, that's it. No, sorry, no more. Your drone swarm can only be 20, and that's it. You've hit your limit. No more drone swarms. That's probably not the way to go. Maybe it is. We don't know. We need to understand the ins and outs of whether you can have a nice solution of, well, only up to a certain amount, or whether it's more complicated. And if it's more complicated, how do we get that regulation working to make it safe? So again, we're going to ask you questions in our first consultation paper that we've been thinking about, and we're now analysing the responses from that paper to think about these issues going forward, the ins and outs of whether you can be a pilot in command for more than one. Will that work? Because you can be definitely pilot in command for more of them as long as you're not taking them all off and landing them at the same time. Or they'll be problematic because as emergency situations arise, you can't possibly be dealing with multiple emergencies. Or it'd be okay in certain circumstances and not in others. And we also think about, wouldn't it be lovely as a simple answer? You've got 3, no more than 3. You'd be fine as long as you've got 3. Probably not going to be a nice simple answer. It would be lovely, wouldn't it? But at least it's good for us to think about what do we think is a reasonable number that one person can keep an eye on at any one time that we might need to think about in those particular circumstances. And then we have problems that arise with regard to rule of the air and emergency services. So if you're a pilot in command, you can depart from rules and circumstances that render such departure absolutely necessary in the interests of safety. And you can understand why you're going to have that particular situation. You have someone in an aircraft who knows they're in charge of a craft with lives at stake, including their own. If you're going to trust anyone, you're going to trust someone with that experience, that knowledge, who also is in a similar situation to take those particular decisions, so can understand why. That they're going to get novel situations that are complicated, difficult. You need one person to quickly and effectively take a decision and give that responsibility to the person who you think is going to be best able to take that decision. What happens if it's an autonomous aircraft? Who is the pilot in command? Will they have exactly the same kind of information to be able to take similar decisions? Will there be situations in which actually the autonomous aircraft might be able to work this out for themselves? Will they be able to take better decisions? If they do take better decisions, can we actually trust them? It might be we think they take better decisions and think, actually, I don't have to worry. The autonomous system will sort all this out. I'm just going to sit here and let it sort out where I land. I'm sure it'll find a safe place. I'll be absolutely fine. But what if it gets it wrong? Will we over-rely on the machine to take those decisions without the human overseeing it properly and perhaps taking what would be a better, safer decision? So we need to think very, very carefully about what we do in these particular emergency scenarios so we can maintain the element of safety and make sure we've got the decision in the right place. We also have to make sure that there is an element of accountability towards in any of these particular systems. We don't want anything to go wrong. If something does go wrong, we need to learn from that to make sure it doesn't go wrong in the future. Will we still have the same ability to learn from these particular scenarios when we're dealing with emergency scenarios and rules of the air with autonomous aircraft or remotely piloted aircraft? So these are the kinds of issues we need to think about. So it may be that the best way we can deal with these particular scenarios is recommending a framework with a forum to collaborate continuously on safety as we take account of how rules develop, how situations develop, how autonomous operations develop. So we're constantly keeping an eye on making sure that we're keeping safety at the forefront of the minds while recognising emerging technologies. So, of course, we asked questions about this as well. And we're currently getting feedback on the ins and outs of how far we think automated and autonomous aircraft can deal with these emergency scenarios. If we think highly automated systems can operate outside the areas of the rules of the air or not, and how far can we come up with a comprehensive system of rules. The difficulty with machine learning and deep learning is they need data sets. Well, thankfully, air accidents are rare. I'm very happy about that. I think most of us are. They do take place. But you're not going to have a full data set of every single possible emergency scenario you can feed to a machine. And do you want the machine to be learning as it's flying? So these are questions we need to ask ourselves to come up with making sure we've got safety while innovation balancing against innovation. So we've got to have the ins and outs of certifying machines as well and making sure they're safe as we go forward. And this is my favourite example because it just made my mind boggle. So we're all used to the idea of hijacking. You all think we know what hijacking is, and we need to make sure we're going to have systems in place to prevent this going forward. And you discover that the law on hijacking tells you that hijacking occurs when a person on board an aircraft in flight unlawfully by the use of force or by threats of any kind seizes the aircraft or exercises control of it, and then you commit the offence of hijacking. Great. How do you seize control of an aircraft in these particular scenarios? Or more interestingly, you're not going to be on board the aircraft if you can seize control of something that's remotely piloted. Not only that, if you're going to have problems that will arise, not just when the aircraft is being flown, but what if the aircraft is ready, about to be flown, and then you hijack it, hack into its system and fly it somewhere else? So we need to think carefully about whether we need to change the law in this particular area. And this is the situation where there has been an ICAO response to the Beijing protocol that recognises these elements and sees the idea that you can hijacking through digital means as well as the means set out in this particular area of the law. We've signed it, not yet ratified it, and we've not implemented it into domestic law. Now, again, it's not our job to say, should we just implement the international law? That's a policy decision. But it is our job to point out, well, there is this solution in international law. Do we think this works? If it works, is this something we need to be thinking about? Does it go far enough? how do we make sure that we're dealing with the law effectively in these particular areas, because we need to make sure we've got proper legal backdrops to make sure we're not being put in these situations which are incredibly difficult, very dangerous, and definitely not something we want to be dealing with. So again, we've asked questions about how should hijacking work, and we're working on the responses. Most of the responses seem to be, yes, it should be updated, please update it. And you can begin to understand why when you go away and look at the ins and outs of how the law works in these particular areas. So these are just some of the issues we've been thinking about in our first consultation exercise, trying to think very carefully about what happens when you take the human away from the equation. When we think about this with regards to ATM and ANS, then we're thinking more not just about the ins and outs of not having a pilot in the aircraft, but we're also having to think about there'll be more and more of them. Do we have an air traffic management and air navigation services that can deal with this without becoming more automated? And if they become automated, what are the consequences going to be of greater automation on those particular issues? And we do have some background papers on this topic that we've been looking at so far, which you can go in and have a look at. And we're moving on at the moment to think about the kinds of questions we need to ask ourselves in our second consultation exercise. That's going to pick up. So we're having to think about, do we need to have different services? So we talked about VTOLs flying perhaps mostly in urban environments. Are they going to need different information about localized weather conditions, about geographical, topographical issues, so they can deal with how they fly safely in particular urban areas? Because obviously most air traffic management systems are not saying, yes, just take off this rooftop, fly over there and land over there. They might do that for various helicopter flights, but they're not necessarily doing it more generically. So how do we deal with that? Do they need particular information in these particular services? We've also had to think very carefully about if we get an increased element of ATM ANS, does that mean we're going to have a different model of service provision? Will we need to have more federal systems, more different localised systems working together, or will we need a centralised system? If it's going to be different systems working together, will there need to be a regulatory framework to think about that? Again, not our decision to say whether it should be federal or not, but we do have to think about if that is one thing we're thinking about, what regulations would you need to make it work efficiently and effectively? And as it becomes more automated, most systems work on human voice. Do you need human voice if you've got an automated system talking to an automated vehicle? Would it be better to have codes? Might be quicker, more efficient, less likely to be hacked, but at the same time then, how do you then decipher all of that if something goes wrong and you need to understand what the problem was? So how do we deal with those particular ins and outs of communicating in these particular areas? So again, these are just trying to come together with some of these specific problems. Lack of human voice. Is that going to be an issue? Not an issue? How do we deal with it? Is it different for remotely piloted? Would it be annoying if you're remotely piloting lots and lots of drones to have voices constantly coming at you? Do you want voices in an emergency to alert you? Not all these kinds of issues are the things we're going to have to think about. Again, put it together of, do we need more precise weather information, more precise topography? Do we need to think much more carefully about whether they need new services? And do you need electronic conspicuity? Do you need to be able to know where all of these craft are so they can recognise each other and navigate in automated systems to avoid each other in these circumstances? So I'm hoping that this has given you a taster of some of the issues that we've been trying to think about. And so it just remains for me to say thank you again for inviting me to talk, for all of your wonderful expertise and feedback we've had so far, and to encourage you to keep talking to us. And I can now hand over to questions, and when I can also hand over to my lawyer who knows far more about this than I do. Thank you very much.